Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
Ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, over the past few months, the members of this body and the members of the United States House of Representatives resoundingly have voted in favor of Senate Joint Resolution 7, which would remove U.S. armed forces from Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. This unconstitutional, unjustified, and ultimately immoral war has repeatedly come up over the last year. And thankfully, America's elected lawmakers in Washington have taken a stand against it. Now the President has vetoed our resolution, but today we have the opportunity, and I believe we have the absolute constitutional duty to once again take a stand on this important matter. Today we have the opportunity to override the veto in pursuit of justice, prudence, and upholding the constitutionally mandated separation of powers. This is one of the most important fundamental features of our constitutional system. Congress and Congress alone may declare war. This is in direct contrast to the way our old national government, the one in London, worked. Under that system, the chief executive could take the country to war. Not in America, not under our system, not in the U.S. Constitution. In fact, it's one of the distinguishing characteristics pointed out in Federalist 69. Now, as we've already heard, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is dire. And estimates show that the crisis is even worse than we had previously thought. The Yemen war has claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people, including a whole lot of innocent civilians, in attacks that can only be described as horrific. It's believed that from 2016 to 2018, over 60,000 combatants and civilians were killed in direct violence attached to this war. But the full scale of suffering from starvation, poverty, and disease is even more staggering than the stark numbers that I've just quoted involving direct combat or direct violence. Over half the population of Yemen is considered currently to be in the crisis stage of famine. An estimated 3.3 million children are malnourished, and over 84,000 children have died just between the start of the war in 2015 and October of 2018. Poor water and sanitation conditions have also led to the largest cholera outbreak in history, with more than 1.3 million suspected cases and over 2,600 related deaths since the April 2017 outbreak. And contrary to the claims of some of our critics, the United States has in fact been aiding and abetting these horrors of this war. Indeed, these critics claim that we have somehow not been involved in a war in Yemen. But in March of 2015, shortly after Saudi Arabia launched its war against the Houthi rebels, the Obama administration authorized U.S. military forces to provide, quote-unquote, logistical and intelligence support to the Saudi coalition. The Obama administration provided this authorization without any kind of approval from Congress. Since then, we have helped the Saudis with surveillance, reconnaissance and information, target selection assistance, and until quite recently, with mid-air refueling. Mid-air refueling, including mid-air refueling involving combat missions. In other words, we've been materially assisting a foreign power in its efforts to bomb its adversaries, and sometimes helping that foreign power to bomb innocent civilians on the ground in the process. Other opponents of our resolution claim that our involvement in this undeclared, unconstitutional, immoral civil war half a world away in Yemen is somehow constitutional is somehow statutorily authorized under the War Powers Act of 1973, which authorizes the executive branch to use armed forces in cases of emergencies and under certain limited, narrow time constraints. But the conflict in Yemen, a conflict between a regional rebel group on the one hand and the Saudi-backed government on the other hand, by no means constitutes or in any way presents a threat to the safety of American citizens in the United States. And our involvement has far surpassed the allotment of any emergency time constraint contemplated under the War Powers Resolution. Still others say that we're not engaged in quote-unquote hostilities that constitute a conflict of war under the War Powers Act. But these critics, of course, are relying on an overly narrow and outdated definition from a 1976 memorandum. A memorandum, I would add, internal to the executive branch. In that respect, it's self-serving, and in one that does not include the indisputably high-tech activities of war today. The way we fight wars today often ends up involving cyber activity, reconnaissance, surveillance, and target selection. The precise activities we're engaged in this war in Yemen. But even aside from that, under the War Powers Act, we ourselves do not have to be involved in hostilities. We don't have to establish that in order to trigger the War Powers Act, that we're involved in hostilities. The War Powers Act is triggered so long as we are sufficiently involved with the armed forces of another nation. When those armed forces of another nation, are themselves involved in hostilities. And there can be no doubt in our minds, not in my mind, not in your mind, not in the mind of any American, that the Saudis are engaged in hostilities in Yemen, and we're helping them. So it's immaterial. It is completely inconsequential if you accept this crabbed, self-serving, narrow, outdated definition of the word hostilities found in this 1976 Department of Defense memorandum. And finally, some opponents of this effort, of this resolution, to call for our withdrawal from this undeclared, unconstitutional, immoral war in Yemen, some of them are saying that removing U.S. forces would somehow hurt our efforts to combat terrorism in the region, specifically against al-Qaeda and ISIS, and would endanger the lives of American citizens and soldiers. In the first place, these critics are dangerously conflating different geopolitical conflicts. The conflict in Yemen is a regional civil war. It is not about al-Qaeda. It is not about ISIS. And even if it were, our resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 7, the one we're talking about today in the context of a veto override debate, that resolution explicitly states that it would not impede the military's ability to fight these terror groups. But furthermore, there is evidence that our involvement in Yemen might well have, in fact probably has, further destabilized the region, and that it has actually undermined the effort against al-Qaeda's affiliates. A 2016 State Department report found that the conflict between the Saudi-led forces and the Houthi insurgents has actually helped al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAP, and ISIS's Yemen branch, to, quote, deepen their inroads across much of the country, close quote. So no, involvement in Yemen is far from being in the best interests of the United States, Madam President. Not in the slightest, not even by a shred. And every day, it only becomes clearer and clearer that Saudi Arabia is not an ally that deserves our unwavering, unflinching, unquestioning support and military intervention. Especially when our own security, the security of the American people on U.S. soil, is not on the line. Last October, there was, of course, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. In February, a report came out suggesting that the United Arab Emirates have actually transferred American-made weapons to al-Qaeda-linked fighters and other military groups. In other words, the Saudi-led coalition is possibly giving our own weapons in violation of our own end-user agreements with them to give to the very terrorist groups we're trying to fight, the very terrorist groups that opponents of this resolution incorrectly suggest would benefit from the passage of this resolution. And just this past week, news surfaced that the Saudis ruthlessly beheaded 37 men who were mainly minority Shia Muslims. 5 of them gay men who were suspected to have been tortured into a confession. Perhaps we ought not be supporting that regime at all, Madam President. Perhaps we ought not give unflinching, unwavering, unquestioning devotion to a regime that treats its own people that way and that has harmed others in its own region in the way that it has. But at a bare minimum, we should not be fighting an unjust civil war on their behalf, half a world away, without congressional authorization. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution unequivocally states that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Congress, not the President, not the Pentagon, not someone else in the executive branch, not some expert anywhere in the executive branch of government, but Congress. And they did so. They made it this way because they understood that the decision about whether to go to war is a decision fraught with immense moral peril. There is nothing pretty about war. And it always, when we face such a decision, involves a decision to put American treasure and American blood on the line. Even if you think that with modern-day weaponry or the modern way in which we fight wars, if you think that American blood and treasure is not being put on the line, that simply isn't true. That is exactly why the Founding Fathers placed this power in the legislative branch, where it can be exercised squarely in front of the American people by their elected representatives. This power was always intended to be exercised only by the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals because of the moral peril necessarily involved in any decision to go to war. Moral peril involving the use of U.S. resources, the putting on the line of American blood, and also the moral peril that it creates wherever we're going to war. If you truly believe that our involvement in Yemen is crucial to the safety of American citizens and America's best interests generally, that is all the more reason to debate it and discuss it. Right here, right now. In fact, the Constitution demands it. It already is the law. We have to do this. If you're so confident that we should be involved in this war, let's debate it. Let's vote on it. Let's let the American people see what we're about. Let's let the American people have some say in the extent to which we put America's good name, its treasure, and its blood on the line. Today, we still have an opportunity to have a say, to take a stand over this most grave matter. I urge my colleagues to take it. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.